talk about, in your book, Finding Your Power, about the difference between a static situation and a process situation. I think that's a really important distinction. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, well, one of the ways we train ourselves to find our power is by looking at the effect of the way we think. And so, for example, there's a lot of research that's been done on pessimistic thinking and optimistic thinking, and people with pessimistic thinking styles are at much higher risk of depression, but they also cope less well during difficult times. And what we need, we're going to be facing some difficult times with climate change, peak oil and these other issues, and what the Transition Town approach is about strengthening the resilience of a community so that we're better able to withstand the shocks and changes that are going to be coming our way over the next few decades. And I think part of that change is learning about the effect of the way we think. So the example you mentioned of static thinking and process thinking, one way of looking at reality is to see reality as fixed and solid. I think of it like a picture hanging on the wall, and people use expressions like, well, that's not even in the picture, it's just not going to happen. You know, that's not in the picture, it's not going to happen. But I think of, and they do it the same way with the personality, you know, I've always been like this, I've always been miserable, I can't see myself changing. And another example is, human nature will never change.
Yes, I've heard that a lot recently.
That's an example of static thinking. Things are fixed and solid. You can't change them, you can't make any difference. But another view is, rather than see reality as a fixed picture, to see each moment as like a frame in a continually evolving sequence, like in a movie film. And the thing about that is, if something's not in the frame now, that doesn't mean it won't be later. So if something's not in the picture now, you say, well, okay, that's just not in the frame now, but how could we invite it in? How could we bring it in? How could we plant seeds in this moment that would lead to later changes that we'd like to happen? Right. And one of the big changes is, how do we break free from our over-dependence on oil? And I mean, basically, we've got to break free from it, because oil is going to run out. It's going to run out at some stage, and long before it runs out, we hit the peak of production, where we reach the point where production starts to fall. And at a time when demand is rising, when demand rises and production falls, that's going to create a lot of pressure in a way that will force up the price of oil. So we're going to need to tackle that oil dependence. And in a way, we've got a choice. We can either do it now while we're still relatively free in our choices, or we can wait until suddenly the supply declines and that we have massive withdrawal symptoms. Right. So where this idea of static thinking and process thinking comes in, static thinking is, things are as they are. There will be business as usual, it will always be that way, there will always be enough oil. You know, that's one way of thinking. Of static thinking, there will always be enough oil. But process thinking is, things change. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus, he said, even the hills and valleys change, just a bit more slowly. And so this idea of everything changes, oil isn't always going to be around. So we need to start thinking for how we're going to live when those changes happen. And so, but it's also saying that it's the small changes from one frame to the next that lead to the larger changes that we see as movement in a film. And what I find useful about that way of thinking is that even really tiny changes that each of us makes, and it might be, I'm going to walk rather than travel by car. I'm going to have my holiday a bit closer to home. I'm going to start talking with people about sharing resources so that we don't use so much energy. Those kinds of changes, they all add up to a bigger picture. And so we come back to that analogy of small dots in a larger picture, that it's the small dots that make the larger picture. And what I like about this is that it's not just that we're one dot in a larger picture, but every one of our choices is like a dot in a larger picture. And I think of it as like a holistic democracy. Normal democracy, you get one cross on a bit of paper every few years, electoral democracy. But with a holistic democracy, you vote with all your choices in your life, and so you get loads of votes every day. And it's a way of finding our power. So rather than feel there's nothing I can do, it's like, well, okay, every day is election day from, you know, dawn till dusk. And how am I going to use my votes? Each choice is going to be a small movement, like the movement from one frame to the next. And it's a question of what's the direction I want to move in. And I think it's about actively thinking about the future. Some people think they can't bear to think about the future because they find it too depressing.
Yes.
And what the Transition Town movement is saying is that we need to reclaim a positive vision of what we want our future to be.
Yes.
And the way to do that is start moving towards it now.
Yes.
You know, don't wait until the oil becomes so depleted that it's difficult to get hold of. Start weaning ourselves off now, and that's a really useful principle in addictions recovery, is weaning yourself off so that we come in for a gradual landing rather than being dependent and not dealing with our dependency and then really crashing in, like the Titanic crashing into an iceberg, society crashing into a collapse in the availability of oil.